Alright. Hey everyone, welcome back to my stream. Today we'll be continuing with learning React. I know it's been a few days since we came back to learning React. I've been doing a couple of practicing code verse streams in between. So that's that. Also, if you're coming from the last React stream, then you would have seen that there were some power failures here and I had to continue the stream afterwards. I also lost a bit of content in between there. Yeah. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna just try to do a quick recap, for you and myself on what all has been done, and then we'll resume from where we left off. So, let's begin. So let's see here. Let's go back to the code first. So last stream we were focusing on making a edit form, right? Well, I guess yeah, form which can edit, delete, and spoiler alert for this stream is that we'll also be adding the feature to add new users. I know because I went ahead into the video a bit. But yeah. So the thing is that some of the content was not captured on stream if you are watching on YouTube. So I'm just gonna do a quick recap. I believe it was the delete part which wasn't covered, but we'll just do a general recap. So first things first, let's oops, not Python, npm start. Oh, is it run dev or yeah, it's run dev, isn't it? Okay, let's load this. So here we have users, and if I go ahead and click on edit, change this to something else, and I hit save, that works. I can also go ahead and delete users, that works. Obviously last time I confused myself on when I reload the page, why is it returning back to its original state as such. uh Obviously there's no, I'm not using any kind of database or any sort here, so there's no persistence. But I got confused there, so in case you're wondering, that's the reason. And what else? No, that's it. We build out the edit functionality and delete functionality. Now let's check what's happening code wise here. So if we go to our component section and let's open up, I believe it's user details, isn't it? That's the component I'm using to render this. So let's go back. So first and foremost, to user details, we're passing in the user and we're also passing in the set users, which we define here. We use the use state method here, right? Um, and then we pass in the set users function into user details. By the way, throughout the stream, I would be referring to method and function. Like, I know there's a difference between both, but I'm going to use that interchangeably. So just keep that in mind. So, if we go to user details again, we are using use state again for tracking the edit state, and it's fine for now, but I believe it's better to just stick to a pattern, right? Like if we're going to call the variable users, let's call it set users. Similarly, if you're going to call it username, let's call it set username. If we're going to call it edit, say edit, it's editing, we need to call this is set is editing. But yeah, let's do that from now onward. Um, so is editing is set to false by default, right? That's what you see when you load the page initially, right? It's not in edit mode right now. Then obviously I track the username and email. Now what do I return? So first of all, let's see that there's a ternary operator here. That I guess it's inside the, no, it's not inside, but oh, maybe I don't, maybe it's inside. So let's see. We have our ID. Obviously, that's user or ID. We add a break tag. We have username. Now, for username, we have a condition. If it's in editing mode, then what we do is, let's see. We render a input field. So that's what happens when I click on the edit button, right? This gets converted to a input field rather than, I believe this is a span tag. Yeah, it is a span tag. Yeah, that's what happens. So if it's in editing mode, I bring up a input tag. If it's not in editing mode, then I just display the value within a span tag. All right, and what do we have here? Yeah, when on change event occurs, or when a change event occurs for the input tag, I obviously update the value of username using set username. I set that to whatever value I'm entering. Oh, well, I guess it's whatever the value changes to. Um. All right. Same goes for email tag. If it's in editing mode, it becomes I render an input tag. Else I just put the value into a span tag, and obviously I change the state when a change event occurs. Then we have a button, right? We have a button for the edit button, right? So notice that when I click the edit button, a button called save appears here. Now here's how I track this. So first of all, when I click the edit button, the only functionality that this button actually does is it changes the is editing value. If it's false, it changes it to true. If it's true, it changes it to false. As simple as that. And based on that, I, as previously discussed, render either an input tag or a span tag. Now, additionally, I also use the is editing variable to define when to bring up the save button. Let's check here. Yeah, as you can see, I'm checking if we are in edit mode, and if we are in the edit mode, I bring up the save button. Else I just bring up I forgot what the technical term for this was, but I don't render anything. It's just an empty tag, although I understand that this has a name of sort, which I can't remember, but yeah. Then what else? We also implemented the functionality for the delete button. Now let's check what exactly the logic is when I click on save. So when I click on save, what happens is that I use the set users function, right? That was passed on when I rendered the component here. So as you can see, users is a list of objects here, each object being essentially a user. Now I need to make sure I update the correct user, right? I don't want to update, if I change the value of Bob to Mike, I don't want to accidentally delete at this first user with ID 1, or maybe change the value for this instance. So I don't want to do that. This is how I make sure I do this correctly, right? So first and foremost, I use the map inbuilt map method, right? Because this is remember this is an array. So what I do is I check the ID, right, to take in the correct user, and then I update that particular user. As I just return what else, I know that it's not a user I want to update, so I just return whatever values were set. I don't try to update is it is what I'm trying to say. Then we have our so I discussed the logic for the save button, right? And obviously after saving it, I change the edit state to false, thereby making the save button disappear and the other changes. Then we also have our delete button. That was the next logic that we did, and I believe the one which was in got on stream, although I have to double check that. But here's what I do for the delete button. It's pretty simple actually. I just use the dot filter method on the users, right? And I return the same array, but I don't return you know whatever user I don't want to return. For example, if I'm trying to delete user with ID 2, I simply don't return the user if its ID is 2. That's it. I return every other users other than the user whose ID is user whose ID is 2 or whose ID is user or ID. Yeah, so that's the functionality for or rather the logic for the edit and delete buttons. Now I think we're in a shape to yeah, we're in a shape to continue with the video. So let's do that.
Now, there's one more thing that I want to do before
We covered the delete button, so
equal to 1 because we are trying to delete the user of ID 1. 2 is not equal to 1, so 2 will be part of the new array. The user of ID 2 will be part of the new array of users. Okay, and all of that gets maintained in a new array that at the end gets returned, and then we're using refresh when I click on this button. Okay.
oh, I think he's gonna use add users now. So yeah, it's the chapter name is add elements to state array.
This condition is checking to see if the IDs are not equal, but 1 is equal to 1. This user with from the 2 1 of ID, you do that we delete user. And so that is really what's happening and mutable that brand new elements to array
All right, here we go.
So hopefully that makes sense. So now I'm going to show you how we can add elements or brand new elements to our users array and also update the state of it as well, and then have it reflect on our web page. So this is actually pretty simple, but there are a few things that I do want to mention and stress later on, especially when it comes to the unique keys that we're going to need. Because keep in mind that right now we're using these keys, we're using the user IDs as unique keys for our components. But what's going to happen when I add an element and then add it to this user's state variable, what is the unique key going to be? Right? I can't just set an ID for the user on the fly like this. Remember that in a typical application, the identifiers, the unique IDs are typically set by the database or set on the backend somehow, either using a UUID or whatever. Okay, so I will address that towards the end of this section of our tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up a simple form, and we can actually do this inside our app component. So I'll set up one real quick. Let's do this. I'm not even going to use the form element. I'll just do inputs. We'll do input, and then I want to set up a label, and this will be for username. Username. We will need some state as well. I'll do that in just a second. And then let me make sure I have one for email. And then email. Okay, so it looks like this. I will actually add this up top over here. And you know what? I'll just leave it like this for now. And let's see what it looks like. Okay, let me wrap this inside their own divs. Okay, there we go. And last but not least, we do need a button. So, you know what? Actually, I will wrap this in a form so that way I can put the button in there. Okay, so we have our username, email, and add user. I will do this. Let me add a couple of breaks just so everything looks a little bit more organized. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's add some state.
All right, let's create that HTML first. So let's go back to app.jsx and create our form here. We can have two divs. Well, let's create one div first and then we can think about two. Have our input. And let's have a label. I believe this takes the name into account, so that needs to be the same. Let's copy the server and do the same for email. Because I believe that we can we can do type equals email, right, to make sure it is an email. Then let's do this. Let's also write in username and let's write an email here. Now why do we have, why is VS Code showing me this? JSON must have one parent element. Oh, I think I know why. Needs, like, the entire thing needs to be put. Is it because, yeah, I think it is. Why isn't it generating a div? Okay.
To bind it to our username and email fields. So I'll just go ahead.
Let's check what the, oh, I believe I didn't save it. So here we go. Okay, I want the username to come before the input tag. Also, let's just put a colon there to make it look more neat. Let's check what we have. Let's create a button, right? And let's also add a break tag. Okay, let's also add a break tag before the two inputs. So we have some space here.
Go ahead and keep it simple. I'll just use
I know he wants to mention something about the user not having the correct ID and stuff. So, huh. So he's gonna do username, set username, password, set password, and
a simple
not password, email, right?
string for each one. For each one of these, the text changes whenever we update the input field's value. So all we're going to do is call set username and then pass in e.target.value. Again, this is stuff that we've already done already, so that's why I'm kind of speeding through it. When I click on add user, what it should do is it should add it to the users array, and then it should display in the document. Okay. Now let me go ahead and just fix this part where you can see that it is refreshing the page whenever I click add user. That's because
That's because we need to prevent the default, right? So, I believe it was here, or maybe was it here? I think it was in here. So on submit, is it on submit?
value e.prevent default, and that will
Yep, that's it. All right. I think we can just do it this way, can't we? Similarly, let's go down. Let's set the username and use the use state function. So let's define username, set username, set that to an empty string. Copy this over and do the same for password. Sorry, not password. Why do I keep on saying password? I meant email. Sorry about that. Cool. So we have the technical term is hooks, although I could be wrong for username and email. Now, was it in, yeah, it was in the input that we are gonna set the value, right? So here we'll have our username. Here we'll have our email. And for our button, we'll have a on change event, which says yeah, which updates the values. So it does set username, and does set email. Oh, actually, sorry, this should be for my bad. Should be for the input tags. Did you mean this or this? What's wrong with this? Oh, okay. If we need those colibris if we ought to use the semicolon, I guess. Let's have the same for email. Oh, by the way, I forgot to turn on my chat in my secondary monitor. I don't think anyone has come live. So yeah, no one has come so far. So yeah, all right, should be good. Okay, so where were we? Yeah, we were setting the username and we were setting the email here. So we have set username, we have set email, and what else? Now we need to define what happens when we click the button. Now, obviously, I guess we'll use set users again. My question is, what would we do for the ID? So the ID is to be a unique number, right? So I'm just wondering what would be the best way to do this in React. So let's see.
will ensure that we don't
First,
have
let's
Jade refresh
see
when we
if
click on this button. Okay.
you
So
know what this is working first. Okay, I see. So we made okay, there we go. That needs to be put in here. Mm. Okay, cool. Yep.
To mention that very quickly. So
Well,
now
I
what I'm going
guess
to
we
do
can
is
do the same for these two, right? So within the user details component for the edit, where's the edit input? I mean, where's the email input? We can change the type to be email.
this. So whenever I click on the on submit or whenever I click on add user, it's going to go ahead and trigger this on submit event because we're inside our form. That's just the default behavior, right? So I'm going to go ahead and console log username and email just so you can see what this object looks like. So I click add user right now, or I'm sorry, not object, the current values. Right now it's currently empty, but if I type something, you can see that it appears right over here. So what we want to do is we want to wrap this inside an object, and then we want to add it to the array of users, but we also need an ID for the user itself. Okay, so this is the part where it gets a little bit tricky, right? Because now you're wondering, well, what exactly do I use for the ID? Now, I'm just going to cut right to the chase, and I'll explain later on why this is very important. But the best thing that you can do when it comes to adding elements to the document dynamically and needing to find a way to associate a unique key with the added elements, because keep in mind that these elements right over here, we are assuming that these are unique IDs that come from some API, and those are typically generated by the database, right? In an application where you need to create a list of data on the front end side that is not going to be generated by the backend at all, you're going to need some unique identifier to identify each element. And I've actually ran across this problem myself a couple years ago, and I've had some discussions with some other more knowledgeable people than I am. And we came to the conclusion that one of the best ways to handle this is actually by using an incrementer to keep track of all of the unique IDs. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create some state, and I'm going to call this counter, set counter. This will be a numeric value. And
I think, did I try this on my own? Maybe there's more to it. Let's not do that right now. Yeah,
I'm going to
we
hold
have
like this just
plenty
as an
more time in future to do our own thing,
example.
make our own projects and
I'm
whatnot.
going to set the default value to 2 because we have 2 elements by default currently. I'm going to set it to 2, and then I'm actually just going to increment it every single time. Okay. Well, actually, I'm going to set it to I'll set it to 3. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create this new user object. I'm going to set the username and email, and then I need to set the ID to be what counter is. So counter will be that over here. Counter will be 3 since that's the current default value. So when we first add a user, the ID of that new user.
And I believe the reason why you can do username and email like this is if the key is same, not just knows to use this as the key and as the I mean if the value has the same name, not knows to use this as the key and the value. Cool. Now my camera did a flip there. Yeah.
Added will be 3. And then all we need to do is just increment the counter by 1. So we can just easily do that by simply just calling set counter. And then we want to make sure that we have the current value of counter. So we're going to use the callback function and pass in that argument and then do current counter plus 1. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to call set users, and then we're going to add new user to the array. And this is actually very easy. The easiest way you can do this is by calling set users, passing in the callback function so you get access to the current user's state. And then you can just pretty much create a new array. You create a new array and then use the spreader operator on the original array. So this will take every element that is inside current user state, which are all of these user objects and whatever has been added to it, and then unpack it and then place it in a new array, preserving its order. And then all we need to do is we can add the new user element at the end, just like this. And again, this does it in an immutable way without directly mutating the array itself. Okay. And if you want to place the new user in the front, you just put it right over here before you spread the current user state. Okay. So hopefully this makes sense. Now let's go ahead and refresh our page and let's add a user. Let's add Tim. And you can see now it works. I can add more users. There we go. I can even delete these users and add it again, but now you'll see that the ID is 5 because it's preserving that counter as the ID. It's using whatever the value of counter is. Okay. Now, I do want to address this because a lot of people will be wondering, well, can't I just use the index of the element in the array as the ID? So what people are talking about is
No, we can't, because if we deleted then delete any user, then the index would change one then.
so remember that the .map function takes up to 3 arguments. The first argument is going to be the value in the array itself, the current value. The second element is going to be the index, so the current element's index, okay? So for example, the index of this first user object is going to be 0, and then this one is going to be 1. And a lot of people are wondering, well, can't I just use the index as the key and as the ID to uniquely define these users? Well, you can't. I mean, you surely could, but you will run into a lot of weird issues that you won't really understand why it's happening.
Because when we
because you
delete
use the index
stuff,
as
I guess.
Now, let me actually rephrase this. You could actually use it as an ID, just not as a key. And when I say ID, I mean the ID of the user object. There's nothing wrong with that, but you cannot use it to key your component that you're rendering to the document, just to be more precise. Now, in a nutshell,
Okay, let's implement the add users functionality right now, and then we'll come back. So let's first and foremost create a variable for the counter. Oops. Let's also set that to 3. And when we click on the button here, we wanna, let's see. First of all, let's create the new user. Now the new user is gonna be, it will have the ID of counter. Then obviously username and then email. Now let's increment the counter essentially. So let's take in current counter, and then we can just increment it by 1. We could also do current counter plus plus, right? Then we're gonna set the user state again. How we're gonna do this? We're gonna first of all, let's take the current users here, and then we'll return an array where we unpack the current users, and we're also adding in the new user, and I believe that should do. So let's just use Prettier here. Great.
don't use.
Let's see if that's working now. So let's call this user Mike. Mike at gmail.com. Add user. That's not working. See what could be the reason for that. Let's go back. Maybe we did not save this, or we did. So on change with the new user, we set the counter. Let's log the counter just to make sure. Well, let's log new user and the counter to make sure it's working first. Huh. It's not logging in that on change event here. I mean, on change also covers on click, right? Or is it supposed to be on click? It is supposed to be on click. But yeah, here we go. We have the new user here, and our previous functionality would obviously still work. Is that a break tag, right? But I'm not sure if the would it still, yeah, there would still not be any type of persistence here since we don't have any database of sorts. So let's do one thing at the end of but I guess what we can do is we can just add a br tag in app.js x, and oh, that did not work as expected. Maybe I need to add it here. Ah, let's add it at the end of this div here. Hmm. Okay, first thing is it adding the, okay, it is adding the break tag, but can't see it visibly now. What about now? So that's this is not what we want, right? And if we add it like this, hmm, let's use our previous knowledge on. Wait, it was called what? Style? Is it like to um direct style in React? Let's see. So yeah, we use this style array, but then we pass in, I believe, an object. So we could have first of all, let's see if this is working. We should this div that we need the yeah, see what I did there. So this style is working, but it's not for the div that we wanted to work. So I know that was a mouthful, but I hope it made sense. We need to go inside here and then apply the styling. All right, okay. Let's set it to what, 10 maybe? Yeah, that looks more better. And if I add another user, there we go.
Indexes as your keys. There are basically a lot of issues that can come across, such as performance impact and a lot of bugs. Indexes component that you are rendering to the document, just to be more precise. Now, in a nutshell, don't use indexes as your keys. There are basically a lot of issues that can come across, such as performance impact and a lot of bugs.
Yeah, and we don't want bugs, do we? We'll be spending quite a lot of time just debugging, and yeah, when we could have avoided it totally.
So just use an incremental counter, especially if you are just building some kind of application where you need to add data that is displayed on the front end that has not reached the back end just yet. Okay, because again, there are a lot of examples where you need to add information to the screen via a form, and you have not sent that data to a server, so the server can't generate a record for that data. So you can't use the auto-generated ID that the server gives you as a unique identifier. So in situations like this, using a counter is perfectly fine. Just don't use the index of an array. Okay, so hopefully this part makes sense. In this section of our React tutorial, I'm going to teach you about the use effect hook.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, these functions I believe are called hooks. So, earlier I said we create the user hook. I guess username hook, it should more be like we create the use state hook for username. Let's just do a quick Google search here. Function components to have access to state and other React features. Alrighty.
If you've been watching, you have been introduced to a hook called the use state hook, which is used to define state and also manage state. I'm going to teach you about the use effect hook because this is a very important hook that every single React developer must understand and be able to use inside out. Because the biggest thing when it comes to React is knowing how to properly use this use effect hook to perform side effects in your application, because oftentimes you will need to perform side effects in your application. So first of all, what exactly is a side effect? A side effect is basically anything that you perform that is outside of the scope of your component, or in the broader scheme, outside the scope of your application itself. So for example, if you need to make a network request, that's outside the scope of your application, because once you make an API request to some external server, your application has nothing to do with it. It's just going to get back the response from the server itself. Another example of a side effect is accessing local storage, which if you aren't familiar with local storage, is basically just a way for you to store data in your browser that you can access later on. Another example of a side effect is being able to directly manipulate the document itself. So if you want to manually update the title of the document, if you want to manually insert an element into the document, that's a side effect. If you want to manually register an event listener onto your document, such as whenever the browser is being resized or if the user is scrolling, these are examples of side effects. There are a bunch of different side effects that you'll come across. These are just common examples.
I thought use effect, when I heard the name use effect, I thought it was something to do with styling CSS and such, but I think it's much more broader, isn't it?
That a lot of developers often need to tackle on. So I'm going to teach you all about the use effect hook, how to properly use it. I'm going to teach you about the different behaviors of this use effect hook, so that way you fully understand how to properly use the use effect hook. So I know right now inside our app component, we have a lot of stuff going on, and I want to make this as simple as possible because when there's just too many things on our screen inside our code, it can be very overwhelming to just track every single thing. So I'm going to make this very simple. I'm going to remove this username and email. I'm going to remove all these users. You don't have to remove this if you don't want to. I just think it's better for us to remove this just so that it makes it easier for us to see what's going on instead of just tracking everything that is on in our code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this counter state, and I'm going to set this to 0, and I'm going to create a button, and I'm going to go ahead and give this button a text called click me, and then I'm going to register an on-click event listener on this button, and every single time we click on this button, I'm going to update the counter by 1. So this will basically track the amount of times we as the user click on this button. So let's go ahead and update the state, just like this. And then I'll go ahead and display that text to the user. You clicked the button, counter times. Okay, very simple stuff, just to show you how this is going to work. You can see over here, we have our text. Currently it says you click the button 0 times. When I click this button for the first time, it'll update, and each time I click on it, it's going to basically just increment by 1. Very straightforward stuff. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and import my use effect hook. Now,
Alright, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna first of all send this, commit this to GitHub, and then we'll delete this and then continue. So yes, we can call this user form completed, or I guess more precisely user details form completed. And we have our edit, delete, save, and add. Let's get rid of everything except for counter and create that button thingy. And we can have our own change event, which basically just increments current counter. Format document. Also we need to set the counter. Wait, what did I do here? Oh, sorry, this needs to be wrapped inside the set counter method, right? I guess I got rid of the host for some reason. Okay. So what did I do here? This needs to say button, and then we can have some kind of span which has this. Why isn't this loading? Too many re-renders. Why, what's wrong with this? Hmm. Well, it's run. I believe it's running in some kind of infinite loop or something. But what's happening? Button on change. Oh, this needs to be. Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. The game to inside what? Game inside React, huh? We will check that out later. Let's needs to be on click. Does that fix it? Or I guess not. But I believe the number of errors reduced here. Okay, let's check the code that no it's written here. So div we have a div, we have a button. Huh. I mean, I'm running a span, but everything else is the same, isn't it? Oh, okay, I see what's happened here. Was this the reason? And yeah, that was a reason, alright. Let's change this to what was used here? A div and a button, okay, wrapped inside a parent div. Oh, did I do something? Yeah, I think I accidentally hit the button here, but I need to be signed in for that to register. Um, let's see. Since it's a div, it would automatically go into the next line. So that break in between, and that's not working. Okay, let's see why. Plus plus is the same thing, but I don't think. Oh, interesting. Why doesn't plus plus work? Plus plus not working in React. Okay. So when you call set number, React then says okay, re-render the page and makes its way down your code and see set I to be 0. Then when you increment your, or in this case 0 plus 1, I is set to 0 again. Which is getting reinitialized every render. The above comment is the best way to do it, but if you really want to use, if it's behind a variable, then it first returns the original value and then changes it. If you put it in front of the variable, then changes it first and then returns the change state. Okay, I guess this is my answer. The increment and decrement operators, right, directly modify state, and thus your component re-renders each time with a newly assigned state rather than just updating the count prop in state. Thus your component re-renders each time with a newly assigned state. So if I do it this way, like I use plus, like just I don't use, if I don't use the increment operator, it updates the variable. But if I use the increment operator, it re-renders my, or it doesn't update it if I use the increment operator or decrement operator for that matter, and it Rather than updating it, just re-renders it, meaning the value would still be the original value. All right, but then I believe I used plus plus. No, I did not. I went against it, didn't I? Like in the previous exam. Oh, maybe I did and I deleted it. Either way, yeah, let's this is working now, so that's what matters. And I believe that explanation makes sense too. If I use plus plus, it doesn't update the value; it re-renders it like immediately. I guess is what it's trying to say. It still needs to be a bit clear to me, but I guess this will do for now. All right. So I'm gonna take a break here, and I'll be back. Right? You guys see ya. Catch you in 5 minutes. I need to add some sort of timer in this, don't I? Alrighty, I'm back. So let's begin. So we finished creating the clicker button here. So let's go back and see how to use the use effect hook.
And remember that the useEffect hook is also a function. So let's import that first from the React package. And the way that we're going to use the useEffect hook is like this. So we're going to go ahead and just call useEffect like a regular function. And this useEffect hook takes up to 2 arguments. The first argument is mandatory. It is known as a callback function or an effect callback. Okay, so this is just going to look like a regular callback function. And then the second argument is optional, but it is very crucial to understanding how to properly use this argument. Okay, the second argument is an array, or better known as your dependency array or a dependency list. It's basically just an array. Okay, I'm going to explain more about this in just a second. But first, what I want to do is I want to omit this because I want to, inside my callback function of my useEffect hook, I want to basically just directly manipulate the document. And there are a lot of different ways that I can do this. I can access local storage. I can update the title of the document. So what I'll do is right now you can see that the title of our document is Vite plus React. That's just the default title. And what I can do is I can just set the document title like this to React tutorial. And so what's going to happen is whenever our app component is rendered, whenever it's mounted to the document, our useEffect hook is going to go ahead and invoke this callback function. Okay. Now, remember what I said? Based off of how you set up your useEffect hook, if you have the dependency array or not, it's going to contribute to the behavior of your useEffect hook and how it calls your functions and how many times it calls your functions. So basically, right now in this current state, every single time my app component is rendered and re-rendered, it's going to go ahead and invoke this callback function. Okay, so just so you know that there are different life cycles of a component. So for example, when it first renders to the document, after it renders, and then when it needs to unmount from the document. Okay, so in the initial stage, we're mounting the component, we're rendering the component to the document, and then in other situations, our component may perform a re-render of itself. And a lot of things can trigger a re-render. One common example is whenever your state updates, your component can re-render. And I'll show you that in just a second. So watch what happens here. So when I refresh the page, you can see that the title is updated to React tutorial, and it does it so fast that you don't really notice the update happening in real time because it's just happening like instantly. Okay, but I want to show you what happens when I console log this message rendering. If I refresh the page, you'll see that it's going to render, it's going to log twice. Now, this is because we are in strict mode, which is what is enabled by default. You can actually turn this off by just removing this React strict mode right over here. And then you can see now it renders once, okay? You don't have to turn it off, but just know that you can if you want to. By default in production, strict mode is off, okay? So when I refresh the page, you can see that it is going to do its initial invocation of the callback function. Now, watch what happens when I click on this button. You'll notice that every single time I click on this button, this rendering is being logged to the console. So that implies that this callback function, this effect callback, is being invoked because obviously in order for this console log to be logged to the console, it has to have this function being called itself. Now, why exactly is our callback function being invoked? So as I hinted earlier, we have some state over here. We have a counter. Every single time I am updating the state of counter, what happens is React is going to unmount and then re-render the component reflecting its new state. Okay, so over here you can see that I'm updating the state of counter. So it's going to go ahead and re-render app. And whenever we render app, remember what I said earlier, when app is rendered, by default, it is going to go ahead and call the callback function of this useEffect hook. And that is why this console log is being rendered to the document. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I can even go a step further and I can actually concatenate this React tutorial title with the counter. And then that way the title will tell you how many times it was updated. Okay, so 18 times, 23 times, etc., etc. You get the idea. So hopefully this makes sense. Each time I make an update to my state, in this current usage of the useEffect hook where I don't have any dependency list or dependency array added at all, by default, it is going to call this callback function every time our component re-renders. Okay? Now, I want you to see what happens when I add the dependency array. Remember, this array is optional. You don't need to have this. But just know that depending on how you use this dependency array, whether you omit it or add it to your useEffect hook, or if you add certain elements to this dependency array, which I will teach you about in just a second, this will change the behavior of how your useEffect hook works. So let's show you this example of what happens when I add an empty dependency array to my useEffect hook. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page. Now you can see that initially what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and call the callback function of my useEffect hook. Okay, and it does it twice because we're currently in strict mode. But watch what happens when I now click on the click me button, cause it to update the state of my counter. Okay, I'm clicking the.
Oh, is it because if I give a dependency, I have to mention that, hey, this is a dependency. So whenever this button or whatever element I add as a dependency changes its state or it re-renders, use that useEffect or trigger that useEffect method.
Button, but notice how the rendering function or I'm sorry, the rendering is not being displayed to the console anymore. And you can see that the title still says React Tutorial 0. Okay? Notice how that is happening right now because I added my empty dependency array. If I remove it, you can see that now it is going to log rendering every single time I click on the button. Why is this the case? So when you add a dependency array, and more specifically, when you add an empty dependency array to your useEffect call, what happens is the callback function, the effect callback, is only going to be invoked one time only, which is when your app component initially renders. And any state that is updated is not going to cause a callback to be invoked, or it's not going to cause the useEffects callback to be called. Okay, and it's pretty evident over here because I am making updates to my counter state variable, but the useEffects callback over here is not being called again and again and again. And that's because I have an empty dependency array. Okay, now I will mention right off the bat, this is a very useful situation when you need to make an API call as an example. So let's say if you are trying to fetch the user from an API and you want to render it to the document and you don't want to refetch the user every single time you're making updates to the state, then you would want to have an empty dependency array added to your useEffect call. Okay, so generally this is very important. It's very common when you only want your useEffect hook to call the callback function one time only. Now, the next important thing to understand is the dependency array and what we can add to our dependency array. So as I mentioned earlier, not having the dependency array will cause your useEffect callback to be invoked upon every single render. Adding an empty dependency array will only allow your callback for your useEffect hook to be called once only, no matter what state variables change. But there are situations where you do want your useEffect callback to be invoked whenever your state is being updated. Now, let's say I do in fact want the useEffects callback to be invoked whenever the counter state variable or any state is being updated. What I want to do for this dependency array is I want to specify which state variables are a requirement for this callback to be invoked. So this is the reason why it's called a dependency array, because the useEffect hook depends on those state variables in order for them to change to cause the callback function to be invoked. Okay, so for example, by adding this counter state variable to this array, what I'm basically doing is I'm saying, okay, whenever a change occurs to counter, call this callback function. Only when counter changes. So now watch what happens if I refresh the page and if I click the click me button. You'll see that when I click on this button, it's going to go ahead and call the callback function again. Okay, if I click on it twice, or if I click on it a second time, it's going to call the function again and again and again and again and again. And this is the behavior that we wanted, or the original behavior that we had when we didn't have our dependency array. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. Now, just to show you another example, perhaps you don't want to necessarily use the counter state variable as a dependency. You may want to depend on a different state variable. So let's do this. Let's say we want to click on the button X amount of times, okay? And then we want to have a synchronize button to basically synchronize the state to show us exactly how many times the user clicked on the button itself, okay? So what I'll do is this. I'll create a variable, another state variable called sync, set sync, and this will just be a simple Boolean value that will just alternate between false and true, okay? And this is a very common approach to being able to detect whenever something is occurring. So what I'm essentially doing is I want to add sync as a dependency to this useEffect hook, okay? And then what I want to do is this. I want to add another button, and then I'll have the text be sync. And then whenever I click on this button, I'm just going to go ahead and just update the state of sync. I'm basically just toggling it. So I'm going to call set sync, and then current, I'm just going to set it to the opposite value of it. So basically, if sync is true, it's going to update to false. If sync is false, it's going to update to true. So we're basically toggling between true to false, false, true. Okay? And whenever I do update sync, what's going to happen is in order for this useEffect hook to be invoked, sync needs to change. Okay? So watch what happens. I'm going to go ahead and click me as many times as I want. Now keep in mind that the counter state is still going to update and it's still going to display in the document just fine.
Let me do this. All right, let me write out the code that we have so far. So let's do that. Let's have another button. And let's import use effect. Let's call it right now. Right, first let's see if this is working. We'll also console.log render to know when this is being triggered. Although I guess the title updating would let us know that, but still let's do this. And okay, so the title is updating, and if I go to my console, alrighty, and what if I add a dependency array, an empty dependency array? It should only run a single time. Yes, so this thing is being updated. The counter is being updated, but the title is not being updated here. Now, what if I add a dependency array for the counter? Right, it works only when this is being updated. To illustrate that change, I'm gonna add the dependency as sync here. Also, this needs to be set to set sync, right? All right, so the set effect is being called, but set sync is being called, but the set effect is only being triggered when I do something with sync. Alrighty. Yeah, like I can update this count and click sync, and then it updates the title. Okay. Now let's see here. So I want to see what happens if I know this gonna raise some error of sorts, but let's see. Does React tell me? No, it doesn't. Alright, either way.
That's normal. But in order for my useEffect hook to invoke this callback function and update the document's title manually, I need to make a change to the current state of sync in order for this callback to be invoked. So watch what happens when I click on the sync button. You'll notice that when I click on the sync button, we logged rendering to the console, and then you'll notice that the title was updated from the previous one to React Tutorial 20. I can refresh the page and show you again. Okay, so right now, the callback function of the useEffect hook is called one time upon render. That's default behavior. Okay, React Tutorial 0. So in the current scope of this callback function, counter, the value of counter is currently 0. That is why it says React Tutorial 0. I'm going to go ahead and click on the button 10 times, and you'll notice that the title has not changed at all. But the moment I click on the sync button, the title now is changed, and you can see that rendering was logged to the console. Okay, so hopefully this shows you how powerful this dependency array works. It's only going to go ahead and invoke this callback function whenever specific state variables are updated. One thing that I do want to address is you'll notice that we have this linting warning over here, and it's telling us that we're missing a dependency called counter. You'll notice that if I add counter, it just goes away. The reason why this linting warning is occurring is because basically whenever you're using a state variable inside the callback of a useEffect hook, React wants you, especially if you have a dependency array, React wants you to add that as a dependency. Why? Because you're literally using a state variable that could possibly change throughout the lifespan of your component. It could possibly change, okay? So if that state variable changes, we want to make sure that when we call our useEffect callback function, that we have the latest value of counter, okay? Because right now over here, by omitting counter, I can update counter as many times as I want, but this useEffect hook, the scope of it will never really know.
So yeah, I guess that because of that, React just automatically picks it up and gives it as sort of a warning.
Okay, and so you might run into some issues. Sometimes you can get away with running into some issues, but generally you shouldn't use state variables inside a useEffect hook if you don't intend to add it to the dependency array itself. Okay, now obviously by adding this counter variable to my dependency array, it would not give me the behavior that I originally wanted, but this is essentially how you would get rid of that warning issue. You could also just not use the counter at all, and you can just leave it like this, and that would be perfectly fine. So there are many different ways that you can go about this, but I did want to address this issue. Okay. So now I'm going to show you an example where we can fetch data from an API, which is another side effect that you will often need to perform in your React application, because whenever you're building an app,
Let's make a commit first of all. Oh, it's not set effect, it's use effect, isn't it? I will just push it.
Application, you typically want to serve data to a client. You want to render that data somehow to the user. And where does that data come from? A server, an API, you name it. So I'm going to use this online server. This is free, and they have it set up with mock data. So I can fetch some posts, I can fetch some comments, I can fetch some albums, whatever it is. I'm going to show you how to make these simple HTTP requests. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So inside my code, now one thing that I also want to mention is that when it comes to the useEffect hook, you can have as many useEffect calls as you want. So for example, I can set up another useEffect hook right down over here, and of course, this will call its own callback function. Another thing that I should also mention is that useEffect hooks, the callbacks are going to be called in order that they are implemented. So for example, this useEffect hooks callback is going to be invoked first, and then this one, and then any other subsequent useEffect hooks that you may have after the second one will be called afterwards. So they are in order. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use the default fetch API that is built in to our browser API to get this data from this JSON placeholder server. So all you have to do is just type fetch, and you'll see that it pops up right over here. We need our URL, the server that we are going to fetch the data from. Now, again, if you're fairly new to front-end development and you don't understand the concept of fetching data or retrieving data from a server, which I assume most people who typically start off with front-end don't really have any back-end experience, let me briefly explain what's going on. So this server, this online server, is basically just going to serve data to any client that wants to make requests to it. So you can see over here, they have a couple of endpoints that they already set up. So I'll show you a simple one. We have this user's endpoint right over here, and we can
Let's just look at the data itself. Um, so, is oh, what's this? Fetch promise also rejected the errors. Catch it, okay? Um, I see. So, I was gonna just check out real quick. Yeah, I'm trying to find the link for that. Maybe it should not here. JSON placeholder. Let's just search for it. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, and alrighty.
make
That works.
HTTP requests. Okay, so that is the protocol that we are using, and the specific method that we would be using is a GET request method to get this data, because we're only trying to retrieve this data and serve it in a read-only mode. We're not trying to create data or update data on the server side. So I'm going to go ahead and take this URL right over here, and I encourage you to do this yourself as well. Take this endpoint or any endpoint that you choose to use, and you're going to paste it right over here as an argument for this fetch function. Okay, that's going to be the first argument to this fetch function is the server URL that you want to retrieve the resource from. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to retrieve this user's resource, which is going to give me an array of objects which are specifically users. Okay, so now with the fetch API, we do need a second argument. Actually, we don't really need this, but I will mention this just for the sake of it, because when we show examples of making post requests, you will need to know how to set up this second argument. But this second argument allows you to set up options for your request. So by default, the request
It's
method
get
is going to be
right.
get request, which means that you're going to get data, which is what we're going to do.
Yeah. You know what? Another question that I have in my mind is in Python we use it. We have the request module to handle all sort of requests. Does not have something separate, or is this something which is used throughout? Or yeah, I'm gonna take a D route here. So yeah, let's just see. Oh, I've heard of Axios. The fetch API. In 2023, the API graduated to a stable state. Pros, it is native to, yeah, it's in build. Um, all right. And then Axios. Is this the most popular one? I have feeling because I've heard it before I came to before I learned Node and stuff. And this was years ago. So then got okay. And there are a couple of other ones too, but I have a feeling Axios is the most popular one out there. Yeah, I mean from the GitHub stars we can kind of estimate that.
So I don't
All
actually
right.
need these options, but what I'll do is I'll set the method to get, just to show you how this happens. And if we were making any post requests where we are sending request bodies, or even a put request or patch request, which I'm sure that this terminology might be brand new to you all, then we would need to set a request body property, which is the body property itself. And then this is where you would actually specify what key value pairs you want to send to the server. So if I wanted to send
Oh,
a
it's the
username, I
object
would
that
specify that in this body
this
object.
needs,
Now,
huh?
obviously, we're not going to be sending any data at all, so we're just going to leave it like this. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that after I fetch the data, I am going to be able to retrieve the data from the response. Okay, because when you fetch data from some server, you're basically requesting the server for that data, and then the server is going to send back a response. Now, in this situation, we're going to get a response back, which is an array of users, and we need a way to actually handle that response. Okay, so before I do any of that, I do want to show you the API call occurring in the browser. So what I'll do is I'm going to go into my application over here. I'm going to refresh the page, and I want to show you the network tab. This is a great tool to inspect API calls or any API calls, any network calls that are happening on your client-side application. So let me zoom out a little bit. So right now I have it filtered out to fetch/XHR, which basically these are just API requests to some server. And you can see that right over here, it is making 2 API calls. And remember what I said earlier, that your useEffect hooks are going to be invoked twice, which because we are rendering the component twice, it's going to cause our useEffect callback functions to be called twice as well, because every single